All right, the last of 3 videos on the Federal Reserve System in our overall series about understanding negative interest rates. The first video, we talked about the foreign influence on the national banking system. The last video, number 2, we talked about the early formation of the first 3 national institutions we've had. And then this video is going to be talking about our current Federal Reserve. Okay, so let's set the stage. From 1900 to 1910, the number of banks throughout the country doubled. By 1910, we had 20,000 banks. Now, most all these banks were considered national banks with a federal charter. So they had the federal charter, which allowed them to issue their own bank notes. And an interesting dynamic was going on as all these banks were opening up. The businesses and corporations that were expanding along with them, they were not borrowing to fuel their growth. They were financing it with the profits of the companies. That did not make the banking centers in the East very happy. So the big banking centers in the East were Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And don't forget the heavy influence and the heavy capital infusion by the Europeans. Now, there were a lot of wealthy families, but there were 2 on each continent that really stood out. J.P. Morgan, so the Morgan family in the U.S., along with the Rockefellers. And with roots in France and England, you had the Rothschilds. And in Germany and Denmark, you had the Warburgs. These names are going to become important in a minute because what happened in November 1910 would change this entire dynamic. There were 7 people that got on a train. Half of them were politicians, half of them were private bankers, and they took a train down to Jekyll Isle, Georgia, where they laid the blueprint for our current Federal Reserve System. Now, the Federal Reserve was actually implemented in 1913. And just to give you a perspective, by 1913, 71% of all these banks have turned to non-national, meaning they were completely operating independently of any type of federal charter. And number 2, these same banks held 50% of all the deposits in the country. That did not make the big money center in the East nor all of the big family money in Europe happy. So something had to change. If you want to get a thorough read, there's no book better than The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. A phenomenal book. You'll learn not only a lot about the Federal Reserve, but also economics and finance in general. So I'm sure you've heard the term wildcat before, and you probably associate that with some kind of oil drilling, oil exploration. But it was actually a term that the Eastern banks used for all these banks popping up all across the country. They considered them as wildcats, and as you can see here, they were cutting into the pockets of the New York money center. So to save time, and also I couldn't do a better job of succinctly illustrating the goal of these 7 individuals, let's just jump to 4 points from the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. These politicians and bankers, number 1, wanted to stop the growing influence of small rival banks and to ensure the control over the nation's financial resources would remain in the hands of those present. Those present meaning the families and politicians in Jekyll Isle, Georgia. Number 2, how to make the money supply more elastic in order to reverse the trend of private capital formation and to recapture the industrial loan market. Remember, whether it's war or commercial enterprise, the money centers want the growth to occur through debt, not through profits or cash. Number 3, how to pool the meager reserves of the nation's banks into one large reserve so that all the banks will be motivated to follow the same loan to deposit ratios. This would protect at least some of them from currency drains and bank runs. Number 3, this is how they sold this to the public, because everybody was very shy about forming another national bank. But this is what they were able to do. They didn't call it a national bank. They called it a reserve, a Federal Reserve. So the cloak they used was, look, you have all these individual banks. They keep running out of money. Let's just bring everybody under the same tent and have one reserving system. Number 4, Should this lead eventually to the collapse of the whole banking system, then how to shift the losses from the owners of the banks to the taxpayers. And we talked about this in video 2, and we clearly saw evidence of this in 2008 when Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and Tim Geithner basically held a gun to our federal government's head and demanded hundreds of millions of dollars to be used to bail out the banks. So in case you think I'm making any of this up, let's look at an independent article that was posted in the Independent. It was a newspaper in New York in 1914. So this is about a year after the Federal Reserve was initiated. The quote is from Senator Nelson Aldrich, senator from Rhode Island, who was one of the 7 people down in Jekyll Isle, Georgia. And here's his quote. Before the passage of this act, meaning the Federal Reserve, the New York bankers could only dominate the reserves of New York. Now we were able to dominate the bank reserves of the entire country. So the big takeaways from this video concerning our current Federal Reserve system is, number 1, they answer to no one. Yes, the president appoints the chairman, and yes, the Federal Reserve goes before Congress to testify, but they don't have to answer to anybody. They are an independent corporation. They are not part of the government in any capacity. That's why you see politicians rail against trying to do some kind of audit of the books. They want to see what's going on. Well, guess what? They're independent. They don't have to do anything. So this 3-video series on the Federal Reserve has been critical in understanding this thread, this control thread that goes through the 5 themes that we're using for this 9-video series. We're going to refer back to this entire issue often, but for now we'll end this video, and next up is going to be a different look at the Great Depression. Thanks for watching.